balances, I think, identity, trust, and privacy, driving positive investor returns. So we have a great panel of investors here to kind of talk about our views. And so my name is Dave Fields. I'm the founder of PTV Ventures. It's a venture capital firm specifically focused on digital identity. So that's kind of who I am. And I thought maybe we'd start by just having everyone just introduce themselves and then just talk about their, just without getting too much into it, just a short snippet on what their perspective or thesis or why they've kind of started looking in identity or what got them attracted to the space. And so Ashley, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Ashley Larson. I'm at Revolution Growth, which is a DC-based VC firm. We have 3 strategies: seed, venture, and growth. About $1.5 billion under management. Large majority of that sits on our growth funds, which is where I sit. And about a year ago, I started getting really interested in cybersecurity and realized it was a place that Revolution really had to establish a footprint. 60% of cybersecurity companies are based here in the DC region. There's limited amounts of growth capital that can help these companies scale to past their TAMs. And we realized that we could be impactful there. So,
okay.
Hi, good morning. I'm Liron Gitig. I'm a partner with FTV Capital. We are a growth equity fund. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, investing out of our 5th fund, which is an $850 million fund. Our lens on this topic comes from the fact that we have a very broad network in the financial services vertical. And we spend a lot of our time understanding what are the key frictions and pain points that banks and insurance companies and transaction processing companies are trying to solve, and where are they seeing gaps? And one of the topics that came up over and over in those conversations was the fact that identity is fundamentally broken. And for a bank many of these banks are getting their lunches eaten left, right, and center by all these innovative startups. And one of the challenges that they really have with going digital and becoming a next generation provider of financial services and the way people want to consume it is regulatory and compliance driven. And fundamentally, a lot of it really starts with identity. And so that's what kind of opened our eyes to that topic. Since then, we've been fortunate enough to invest in ID.me, and Blake Hall, the CEO, is here, which has really informed a lot of what we know about the space and sort of our thoughts on where it might be going.
My name is Parag, Sheth. I'm at the Maryland Venture Fund. We are a sector agnostic and a stage agnostic fund. We manage about $140 million in assets. We really look at our opportunities in the sort of probably the more broadest in terms of sector on this panel here. But we really look at opportunities to invest more from a overall company and the market and the management team's perspective rather than the specific technology. And as a result, we do end up investing in identity featured companies or broader cyber companies, but not necessarily just in a specific sector.
Great. So, this isn't an investor conference. This is really, this is an industry conference. So we predominantly, I assume, have, founders or people who are interested more on the company side. And so I think one of the most valuable things the panel could probably do is share with the audience, maybe without getting too much into the secret sauce of your selection criteria, but how do you, are there some criteria that you could share with the audience that would kind of maybe help people, help founders focus their pitch or how to think about their business model? Because one of the things that strikes me is, identity is very broad, right? Identity is huge. It's this massive topic. But, startups and companies need to have focus. And so how do you think about maybe that balance, and what is it that you look for specifically in some of these different startups? And we have both cybersecurity and financial services. So maybe you could, Ashley, you could start by just talking about your lens a little bit. And
Sure. So we have a pretty strict set of criteria that we use in looking at the space, and it's developed through a deep understanding and a lot of data analysis on where exits have happened in the space and where IPOs have happened, and the pricing differential between an A, B, and a C round, and a number of other characteristics relative to some of the earlier stage companies. So out of the growth fund, which we hope to invest at what we call the speed up stage, so where we across the board, not only in cybersecurity, but in enterprise software, in food and beverage and consumer, it's always at the speed up stage where the introduction of sales and marketing capital and maybe a few relationships can really start to get the engine spinning. So I've defined that at a $10 million mark in cybersecurity, and the reason for that is because at 10 million, the majority of product risk is removed and tech risk is removed. You can start to see the early signs of customer adoption. So in industries outside of financial services and healthcare. So, a broad base of customer sets is really indicative of when a company is starting to get that, hit that inflection point. And that's a point, as I said, where we can come in and typically help, particularly on the sales and relationship side.
So just to sum it up a little bit, you're very more quantitative and qualitative focus at that stage. So you're really expecting the story to be borne out in metrics and hard data?
Yeah, I'm a growth investor, and most of these companies are raising a C round,
Right.
Maybe a B round, and so they've done this a number of times before. So, typically, they come in, pretty polished and buttoned up, but, the main things that I tend to focus on are really, can you sell this to a CISO? Where does this fall in the relative, priority list of all of the cybersecurity challenges that a CISO faces? Are your sales cycles increasing or decreasing? If they're increasing, that's bad, et cetera, customer acquisition cost, et cetera.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, and I would say we're very similar. I often refer to it as an expansion stage. Ashley was very thoughtful about what it means to her. To me, I sum it up as we get to be very lazy. Early stage guys have a really challenging job because they meet very talented men and women who are very passionate about tackling something, and it's very ephemeral often at the stages where they're making their investment decisions. Whereas we get to sort of look back and say 10 million or more revenue, check. Are they growing 50% or more? Check. What do the unit economics look like? Data. And so to some extent, a lot of that screening takes care of itself. But that being said, not every company we look at necessarily has something differentiated enough or the right team to take it to the level of scale that we're looking for. And so certainly team always an important driver. And if you don't think you're funding at least an entrepreneur, if not a team, that you can envision tackling a lot of even the just operational challenges of building a business of that scale, that's a major issue. The other thing we look for, though, is how incremental is the solution? A lot of the time, and you may see the same thing, Ashley, and certainly Parag as well, we see companies that they're doing really well and they kind of have grown, but when you look at how sustainable the growth is, they've kind of found a pain, they've engineered a solution, they're a step ahead of a whole bunch of competitors, but that race is not an easy race to predict. And when it's kind of just who's a step ahead at a moment in time, it's a very hard thing to get your arms around and say, how are we going to build a really big and important company? And so we start to look for things that are more around what is the real disruption here? Why are they winning and how sustainable? Is there a network effect? Are they really changing the way their customers look at solving this problem as opposed to, for the time being, ticking 3 more boxes on an RFP? And sometimes that's obvious. A lot of the time it really isn't. But those are the things that I think we spend a lot of time trying to figure out.
So again, being sector agnostic, right, and our backgrounds, we are operators. My partner and I built a few different companies. But our focus, first and foremost, is on the teams. We absolutely do a ton of diligence. We tend to work with teams for about a year to 18 months before we take a look at an investment. We look for management teams with a track record of execution. Doesn't mean they've had to be CEOs before, but they certainly have had to have a track record of doing what they say they do. That is by far where our thesis is centered around. The second part that is critical for us is capital efficiency. There are a lot of great markets that one can chase, but there's only so much capital available. And I think getting to what Liron and Ashley are talking about, which is execution, if we did an early stage deal, well, there needs to be a point where you can get to that stage where these guys become interested pretty quickly, right? And or efficiently at least. So that's the second piece of our of our stool. And the last one is large markets. Right? Goes without saying, I think for all the venture folks, I think we're looking for returns that are driven by large markets, driven by growth. And so the sort of appendix or the addition to that is the overall technology, is the overall product that the company is thinking about or deciding or has made. Is it a feature? Is it a product, right? Because you can only get growth if you are sort of addressing a large enough market in a comprehensive way. Generally speaking, there are always exceptions to everything, but that's sort of where how we look at investments in this space and any other space for that matter.
So I think that's actually a good transition point to talk about identity as, when are we looking at features, products, and kind of platforms. And so we have sort of three different approaches: cyber, financial services, and then a sector agnostic approach. And so how do you try to discern, even though you have all sorts of metrics, right? But to the extent that a company, a startup with a product that's gotten to a certain revenue stage can evolve and really get bigger and become transformative, is going to define what the exit opportunity really is, right? That's going to define, is it going to be acquired? Is it an IPO-able company? So what is it qualitatively maybe that you look for? Because it's not always going to be data-driven necessarily, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can answer that question generically, and
Right.
then maybe more specifically around what I'm excited about in identity. So generically speaking, I don't really care if it's a point solution or a platform. It depends on where it's priced and where it can exit. So I mean, it's just math, right? And so for example, we have a thesis around really risk critical specialized security. So security wrapped around things like ERP systems or medical record systems. Really small TAM for that, but there's basically one company in each category, and because the solution is so complex to build and develop, it's such that you're going to probably get a decent exit, even though it's a small TAM. There's also really large categories like email security and encryption, which have a massive TAM and might have different customer or ASP dynamics, and that gets factored in as well. But with identity, as with most things, I tend to be fairly thesis driven. So really trying to understand, what are the root causes of a lot of the problems that we're having or experiencing in a sector, and what tailwinds are behind that I feel are going to increase or encourage the adoption of particular sectors. So, one of the areas that I'm really interested in is I've seen it called like data privacy as a service, but basically companies that can come in, Wirewheel as a local company that's doing this, can come in and help companies understand where their data is. So that's like the first problem, right? And is knowing what you're capturing and where it's stored. So I say start there and then build out.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with sort of laying it out in that framework. And a lot of the time you hear people say, well, for me to be interested, a company's got to be a platform. And then you say, well, what does that mean? And I've not really still ever heard a well-articulated definition of what that means. That being said, for me, when I look at identity, the word platform comes to mind. And what I mean by that is, we came to this problem having had some successful investments in the past around things like identity management, and they were really around access management and enterprise and employees. And then we sort of understood that there was a challenge, and at first we thought about it as a security challenge, but then we realized it wasn't just security, and often identity and authentication get confused or combined, and they're not necessarily the same thing. And what we realized is that there was something more fundamental, and we realized this in part through some of the conversations in our network, but really in part engaging with ID.me, who really helped me understand that the identity challenge, it's not that there's a pain point that's being solved, it's that there's an entire ecosystem of services that cannot be delivered without identity being treated as a platform rather than a point solution. And it actually took me quite a while to understand that. But after about 4 or 5 sessions, it started to sink in. And what I realized is, to me, that's very disruptive. It's a major challenge. And when you see companies like that, one of the questions then becomes, okay, we can script out how it might look for this to be an interesting way to solve the problem. But really, how do you get there? What's the tactical roadmap for how do you go and become a platform or a network or any of these words that get thrown around? And so for me in the identity space, I've sort of become convinced that there's a very big opportunity around that challenge of becoming a platform that enables others to deliver services that today they really can't bring to market.
So, I think I agree with a lot of the stuff that's said here. I think for us, when we look at, we also happen to be stage agnostic. So we've got a really broad swath of opportunities that we consider. But I think, when we look at investments in the identity space or otherwise, I think it comes down to where is the application, because one of the challenges that I think I've seen is there is great technology which has a broad opportunity for application, but unless you sort of create traction in one or two specific verticals and take that all the way through, I think it's kind of hard to say, you've actually addressed all of the requirements of those verticals, and then how do you, because that to me, that the next step is it leads to scaling the business, right? If you figured out how do you apply identity within a fintech world, for example, and then all the different requirements associated with fintech, well, now you've got a business that's focused on actually solving a pretty large issue that exists, and now if you've put all your wherewithal around it and have created the best product that can address a large market, then that's great, rather than looking at something that can be applied in multiple different places, where I think there is a risk of getting defocused and therefore really not capturing any piece of the market.
That's great. So maybe another thing we could talk, or aspect we could talk about of investing is, are there certain criteria that you find disqualifying, right? In different industries, different investors always have different things that they don't want to touch. Sometimes it's regulatory risk. Some people love technology risk. Some people don't like technology risk. Are there, identity, if we walk around the exhibit hall right now, we'll see companies that touch upon legal, civic, social, financial, healthcare identity, right? It's very broad. So are there certain parts of identity that you don't like, or certain criteria that concern you that you think, for whatever reason, whether because it caps an exit, there's likely to be unseen liability? What are certain things that maybe concern you from your investment lens, if any?
Yeah, sure. So honestly, blockchain, because I don't understand it. I'm working on it. What else? What the things that I don't like are crowded spaces with a ton of players and a small TAM. Like, that's the worst, right? So, the equivalent might be, endpoint security, which I know is becoming a much bigger deal, particularly related to identity. But that's actually an area that scares me, the endpoint protection and endpoint, response, because there's so many companies and they all do about the same thing, and a ton of capital went in there, and a lot of the companies are overpriced, and so where will that go?
Expensive is always a disqualifier. Overly expensive.
Yeah, hop in here, guys.
Well, so I would say you hit on something for sure, which is, and it is relevant to identity space. It is something that you have to be thoughtful about. Is there are certain sectors where they're very susceptible to regulatory change, and in an unpredictable regulatory environment, that can be a very scary thing, because it can be very binary to a company's success. Sometimes it can be a massive driver, and sometimes we've had companies that have gotten crushed by regulatory change that was just kind of a little unforeseen and often very political in nature. So that's something to be wary about. But generally speaking, I like companies where I can understand a very tangible value proposition and a very transparent business model that really, where the customer can marry well what they're paying, why they're paying, and what's the benefit they're getting. And it kind of sounds obvious, but it's really not.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a huge disconnect in a lot of cases among CISOs and CMOs and head of sales. And there's been a proliferation of buzzwords everywhere. You can't have a conversation in a lot of these sectors without just hearing some word that doesn't mean anything. And I think that a lot of that stems from the fact that there's been historically a lot of sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt marketing around a lot of this stuff. I think that is changing. But identity as a sector really only got mainstream a year ago, maybe a couple years ago. So I think that we're all still learning.
I think the only thing I would add is two things. One is, I think for us, it comes down to clarity of really understanding the end game, right? Because there is a lot of noise around a lot of different sectors, but if I can't figure out what you're talking about and get my head around, how this sort of goes from point A to point B, then that becomes a difficult investment. I think the second piece of that, and my background is all sales and marketing, and is in, are you changing human behavior, or are there changes that are not natural that have to occur for product adoption? And because, it's great to have this notion that you can change the world, but it's pretty difficult and pretty expensive to actually do this. And we did this in one of my businesses. It was very hard to do. But I think if you got sort of those two things where I can see the path from point A to point B, I can see how the product is going to be adopted and what channels do we need to what levers do we need to pull at the customer level, then okay, now we can get something. Then it's all execution from there, and the people can we can put the folks in place to make that happen, right?
So I think, my next question would be, this is kind of hitting off something that you just said, Ashley, about it becoming a lot bigger in the last year or 2 years. At some point, this happened, and there was some sort of inflection point. And so my question is, as investors, do you think my view, or the view that I use when I articulate this to other people, is I say, look, identity, every network-based service requires, identity, a way to handle it and deal with it. What are network-based services? IT, communications, financial services, healthcare. If you look across those industry verticals, the biggest pain point is identity, right? And so these are really, really large problems and services that everybody uses. But is identity, will it be considered its own industry or asset class from an investment perspective? Or is it still something that fits inside of all of these verticals? Clearly, I've made a bet that identity is the industry and the asset class, and that investors want to get exposure to it. But do you think that's a view that's going to be borne out, looking out 5 years, or?
So interesting. I was actually thinking about this on the way over here, and one of the things that I sort of realize is that I think cybersecurity and identity, this all falls under the category of what I'll call digital risk management. So we have just such a growing attack surface in terms of our digital footprints, and there's a lot that needs to happen to make our digital lives as secure as our physical lives. So I think of it more in terms of understanding, quantifying, and managing that risk.
I think the other way to look at it, if I'm an entrepreneur sitting and thinking about starting a business and I have a technology that solves an identity issue, the question is, what is the goal? What is the end game? What does it solve? Whether you pick healthcare or fintech or otherwise, and because in each of these scenarios, right, healthcare as an example, there are just so many different avenues that you actually have to create the application for. And you have to go through regulatory hurdles in this instance just because of the electronic health, the EHRs, right? And so as an entrepreneur, I want to make sure that I have a clear understanding of that industry, because identity by itself it's good, but it's got to do something that solves the end user's problem. And I think as a CEO, I'd like to understand that completely before. And then if you do that, then you can explain that to the investors, and I think that helps create the thesis around AU.
So I do think it's true that there are certain places where you want to look and say, what is the end user problem? How do we solve it? And it might be a security problem. But I actually, is this emerging as a category? Like, to me, I look and I actually think there's something much bigger going on that is creating some sort of category here that's removed from, is there a security issue that's, that needs to be solved for me to consume a healthcare service. Those things are important for sure, but I look at everything from, first of all, this Equifax breach. Forget about why it happened, because every day I meet another security company who says, if Equifax had bought my product, this would never have happened. They all seem to have the solution. But the fact that all of a sudden people are saying, what the hell is even going on in this industry? Like, consumers are understanding, like, why is all my data there? Why do I need to rely on these businesses that have these models that I don't even understand? And by the way, I can't even control my own data. They get breached, and first they want to charge me to like keep my data from flowing out. Like, none of it made sense. And all of a sudden people are starting to question, what is the role these guys are playing, and should they be playing that role? And why is this not something I, as a individual and as a consumer, have more control over?
Well,
And then,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry, just similarly, you look at like things that are going on now with Facebook, where all of a sudden it's like, there's all this noise and all this news, and you can have whatever view of it you would like, but like, where is this all coming from, and who are these people, and why am I being deluged by it? And like, increasingly, I think there's this concept of, in an online world, I feel like I should control my identity. I feel like I should be able to expose it when I want, how I want, and similarly not expose it when I want. And I feel like there should be a way for me to rely on interactions and there being an identity on the other side of it. And I think like that's like a paradigm shift of how we view not just logging on with a username and password and then all of a sudden you have some avatar or whatever it is, but rather just a different way of looking at and controlling and interacting with identity that I think is going to lead to a lot of change. Sorry, Ashley.
Yeah, no. Absolutely. And I was going to say, you know, I've been thinking a lot about that too, and I think it's a result of a couple of larger cultural issues in a way. So, you know, first of all, the U.S. has learned to put its trust in corporations, not our government, which is the opposite of the rest of the world. Hence, the reason that the U.S. is the only country in the entire world that doesn't have its own set of overarching privacy laws. Turkey was there with us until a couple years ago, and they passed one. So anyway, so I think that we're sort of left in this lurch where, you know, we haven't built our infrastructure in the way that we need to because we've placed our trust in corporations who've been doing stuff and they didn't even build it right. And so now it's a matter of how do you fix that and streamline it with a lot of the RegTech stuff that's coming out.
Though when you do that now, as a business, if you're looking at who's controlling the identity, is it the consumer or is it the company, then you've got to come up with a solution that addresses both sides of the equation, because I don't know that that's separated, right? And so, but that's a difficult proposition. Doing one is hard enough, let alone doing both sides of it. I don't have an answer to that, but it is something to think about.
So maybe another way to think about this as well is, so, you know, identity, we've have all these problems and we've kind of like talked about them at length. And we know kind of we have a presentation of the different industry verticals that, you know, you're basically investing within. The other aspect of it is kind of technology themes and trends. And so maybe we could just start to shift a little bit and say, you know, we're talking about kind of the problem space at length. Are there specific technology themes or trends or emergent technologies that particularly excite you with respect to some of these problems you're looking at? And I know it's not going to be blockchain.
I'm excited about automation in general, right? I mean, everybody's talking about automation, orchestration, you know, making things run on their own, and machine learning, and making decisions more smartly. And it's hard. So, I think that I don't know of a lot of companies who are doing it really well in some of these critical areas, but if I did find a company where, for example, I thought they could automate the entire process of finding customer data and determining which parts of that are PII. So right now, you know, there are platforms out there that will, you know, show you the data, but they're not going to flag it for you if it's potentially PII, and it's a lot more manual. So improving workflow.
Should we switch it up? For us, one of the areas that I've been sort of looking at is storage systems with cybersecurity built into it. And for whatever reason, right, we've got data that's sitting in the cloud. There are private networks that still exist with a substantial amount of data, especially if you are a media company or a life science business. You can't really put all of your information on the cloud. And not a lot of these storage systems have built-in cybersecurity today. And I think that is going to become an emerging part of the business, just given where things are going. So that's one area, I think, and the other one that's sort of one of the things we're looking at is how do you make it easy? Because again, if you look at the demographics of at least the United States, as it gets older, how do you figure out a way to keep things secure through mobile platforms and otherwise for the older population that's sort of becoming more and more prevalent in the country. So those are a couple of different areas that are becoming interesting for us.
Yeah, and one of the other areas, I don't know how investable it is, and it's an area I've been looking at investments in for 15 to 20 years, and you sort of wonder why it hasn't happened, but I do think that inflection point is coming, is everything around biometrics, right? Like, it should be the case that you can use biometrics to access far more in a much more consistent manner than you can today. And the phone makers are starting to get better and better at it, but for many years there have been people just even voice biometrics to do a password reset at a call center. Like, it makes a lot of sense, but actually getting those things so that they can be adopted on both ends has proven to just be more challenging and inconsistent than people would have expected. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, that is going to play a major role in how we interact with a wide range of services in the marketplace, and figuring out how to make that, again, consistent, adoptable, available, and easy to lots of different demographics, which is always a challenge. The identity space has a major challenge, which is that there are a lot of demographics out there, some of whom don't have digital exhaust, and some of whom don't have a lot of the things that we build identity on. And so figuring out how to extend into those markets and making it ubiquitous, I think, is going to be an interesting area to watch.
In terms of the biometrics, how big of a role has the declining price points of the component hardware parts played in the adoption curve? And do you think we're at the inflection point?
Yeah, I mean,
where
I
it
certainly
starts
don't
to
know.
matter?
I don't know that I have an informed opinion to weigh in on that. What I would say is I go talk to banks, and they don't know how to adopt it. Forget that. That is a piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
But even like, how do they adopt it consistently? You go to a bank and you say, great, I want someone to log in using their face to get, and they're like, we have so many different login systems. The idea that we'd even have one way for someone to all of a sudden have access to all of the different financial services that they'd expect to have access to, they're still trying to figure out how to do that. And then how to do it with a biometric, and should it be a face or should it not be a face? Should it be a range of things? How do we manage the risk around the fact that certain of them may be more secure than others, and yet we want to have the choice? Like, there's a lot of complexity, and then along with it, that for sure part of the challenge was people have been talking about facial for a long time, but it was like you needed to buy a specialized webcam and set it on your desk and in certain light, and like a lot of these things, and if you moved a little too much, I think those things are becoming more commoditized, although you saw that some of the smartphone rollouts are still really struggling with doing a good enough job there.
Yeah.
I think what's also becoming interesting is now you're starting to pair that with behavioral data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because biometric is just one piece of it now. Are you really the person at that location at that time? And there is enough data that's being captured through the different applications on mobile phones that you can use that to say, hey, based on your past behavior, this may not actually be the person there. So there's some fascinating things going on in that space altogether.
So it's interesting, having made both a behavioral and a static biometrics investment, I would, which are also software only. I would argue that both mobile and software is eating the world, and that lends itself actually to biometrics that don't require specialized hardware. But rather than talking my book, I'll ask another question, which is, I think in this one common theme that we had in this last give and take was data came up. And so one thing we hear a lot is data is the new oil. And I particularly don't like that metaphor because I think there are other ways of talking about economic inputs besides comparing it to carbon. And so one thing I would ask, there's different liability associated with data than with oil. There's different properties because it's the world of atoms versus bits, right? You can replicate data ad infinitum. For the most part, that's not the case with carbon. So I guess one of the things I would ask now is how do you think about, when you're looking at companies, how do you think about kind of like what their access is to data, what's proprietary, what isn't, how does that inform your lens?
That's a great question. And so I was telling somebody earlier, I just got back from a women in VC retreat. So there were 20 of us out at a resort in Arizona, and so we were all just chatting. A lot of us were talking about what are the things that are concerning you about your portfolio, and how are you thinking about managing your portfolio? And across the board, women from every region of our country, every size and stage investor, most of them said we're starting to get really worried about privacy. And whether or not our portfolio companies have the right policies in place, and what the risk is if they don't. And in fact, yesterday I was talking to our managing partner, Steve Murray. We have an investment in a company called Tala, which some of you may know. They're a really interesting fintech business focused on the underbanked and providing credit to the underbanked in emerging markets. What they do is they use natural language processing placed against your text messages and emails and your app usage and things of that nature to give you a better and more accurate, credit assessment and score. So, we're sitting there thinking, gosh, with all this Facebook stuff that's coming out, and all the Clarabridge stuff, or Cambridge, then, how do we move forward from here? So I think it's definitely a topic.
I think it's probably the biggest challenge that faces us, right? Because as much as I think we like to believe it's our data, it's not. Yeah, I'd like to think I'm in control of it, but I'm not, because my data does reside on so many different servers across the globe that, and at any given chance, there's opportunities for anyone to go take advantage of that. And so I don't really have a good answer on how, but it's a major issue. So how, and that, earlier on in the conversation, we were talking about my data versus, where it resides, but you kind of need both those ends to sort of work together for this whole thing to stay secure. And I think we're far from it.
Yeah, and I would just say, I don't know that I have a lot to add, but it is something that for sure when you are meeting a company, you're really trying to understand what data are they using, how do they get that data, is it proprietary, is it valuable, do they know how to make it valuable? This whole Cambridge thing, you guys have probably seen it too. I see, like in the ad tech space, I see so many companies that are providing data analytics as their value prop, and you say, well, where do you get your data? And they say, well, all these like little flashlight apps and travel apps that you download, like we have deals with those guys. We take all the user data. Users have no idea that's going on. Their entire company is built on doing analytics on this data that they could lose access to very quickly if all of a sudden, let's say theoretically, Facebook decides they're going to be more stringent on who can access user data. And so the data is out there, and the truth is it's always going to be out there, but figuring out how to build business models around it is something you have to be really, I think, thoughtful about and cautious about.
As it applies to GDPR, are you advising your portfolio companies that this is the new global normal and that you think that the overall regulatory environment is trending towards a European approach, or would you advise them with regard to the U.S. to continue on the present U.S. path, which is still relatively wild west as it comes to data privacy?
So I personally, while I have like my own views, probably not the right person to advise my portfolio companies on that. And I would probably refer them to people who are more knowledgeable than I am on that topic. But that being said, I think companies are orienting around GDPR, regardless of how much they do today in Europe, with the assumption that that is going to be a wise set of business practices for them to be adopting.
Yeah, I think GDPR is really important because it puts a spotlight on some of the issues here and puts a dollar mark on non-compliance. But I don't think GDPR is the answer to solving a lot of these problems. I actually think that particularly as it relates to cyber theft and things of that nature and identity theft, maybe it's a Wall Street issue. We lose $150 billion every year in cyber loss due to attack, and think about the impact that has on our economy. So getting more serious about having the right conversations around identity and privacy and data and security at the board level is going to be, I think, more important. I've never had an ICO come up against me, but that might be because I'm not cool enough or like not looking at the right companies. So,
I mean, we've had a couple of our companies talk about doing something like that. I have yet to develop a full understanding of really how that works. It's actually was surprisingly strange and complex to me as I dove in on what actually the currency is being issued against and the right to it. It's really quite complicated. And as I said earlier, I tend to favor things with like very transparent business models, very clear connection to value proposition. For me, that may be my own limitations intellectually. That's not in that category yet, but it comes up for sure.
And I think, again, this goes back to, early on I said, if you have to change human behavior, that's usually hard to do. And I don't know that anyone has a clear picture of what that actually means, as Liron just said. And so, yeah, we haven't seen a whole lot of there. But there are conversations that happen, but it doesn't mean there's a solution out there yet. It may happen, and as with everything else, it will happen in the future, but in some shape or form. We'll see.
Do we have one more? So I think we're actually getting up to the bottom of the hour. So maybe, does anybody?
One question right
oh,
here.
we do have a question. Sorry.
So the issue of regulatory risk came up. What about the conflicts in regulations? Because GDPR versus AML, for example, would seem to have a lot of conflict. How do you sort of balance that out in your evaluation of risk?
Look, I think there is GDPR, but even if you look at the last decade or so of privacy laws, even within Europe, they've differed on country to country, and I think those deltas would always be there. I think at a generic level, you can look at it and say, yeah, we're all trending in one direction. And despite all those laws having been present in Europe, we in the U.S. have never really adopted a very strong privacy policy. So when we look at, you kind of have to just say, here's what you can end up doing. And so if you build for the GDPR world, I think you will get close enough and then customize it.
It's not. There's no straightforward answer to it when regulations conflict. I think, first of all, sometimes it's interesting to look at companies who have solutions for how do I manage my regulatory posture, because it's incredibly complicated. I think those things do often work themselves out, and even like AML and GDPR, I'm not familiar enough exactly at the intersections, but I actually think depending on the uses and how there are ways to manage and maneuver those things. I think the complexities often come from, there's often, especially early on in a regulatory change, just a lack of understanding of, so what exactly can I do and can I not do? And sort of those fringe cases need to intersect and collide a little bit for those things to get worked out.
Anyone else? So I don't know, would you guys like to offer like parting comments or? I guess
you guys have been a great audience. Thank you.
There we go. So with that said, thank you all for coming.
Thanks.